The world around us is hostile to the Word of God and to biblical values, but we are called to be salt and light, to stand for truth in a decaying culture. We are not called to run from the fire, but be willing to step into the fire. God has placed you at this time in history on purpose and for a purpose. Join us as we get better equipped to address civics and culture from a biblical worldview. Welcome to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church. Let's welcome our hosts, Debi and Sam.
Today's topic is federal versus local power, and this is an episode that Sam and I are going to do alone today, so welcome to Into the Fire.
Yes, welcome everyone.
Yeah, so I think there's, I'll let Sam start asking some questions, but it seems like there's confusion over why the local level politics are so important. State and local cities, school districts, those things, why the federal government cannot just fix everything that's going on. Right. It takes up most of the news cycle. All of those things are talking about what's happening at the federal level. But there's a lot more that goes on in our day-to-day lives that people, I think, don't totally understand how those things go together and how they work together.
Right.
So we wanted to have a conversation about that and talk about some specific cases of things that kind of illuminate why that's important.
Right.
Or illustrate. Whichever,
yes.
pick an I word.
Pick an I word. Well, because most of us know that there's different territories which our government has power in the terms used, federal, state, and local. But each territory has their respective governance, which they preside over, and how that relates to the individual varies.
Right.
So can you give us a brief breakdown to remind us, like, there's federal, state, and then we have local that constitutes of like city councils and school
right.
boards.
Well, and even in the state level, so the federal government, right, we have the president, all the executive branch of all of the different cabinet members and the U.S. Department of Treasury and Education and all those different entities that are there that have been really in the spotlight because of DOGE, and we had a whole episode talking about some of those things. We had one episode about that. The legislative branch there is supposed to have the most power, actually, at the federal level, which is Congress and Senate that make all the laws, and then the judiciary, which really didn't have a lot said about it in the Constitution because they were expecting it to be really minor, but it ended up wielding a lot of power.
Yes, it did.
And we'll talk a little bit about the Supreme Court today, but then what you have to remember, too, is that the states, when we first became a country, right, the states, we were all individual governments in the different states, and they decided to join together. But one of the concerns was, the federal government not having too much power. So there are state governments as well. Each state, like in Arizona, we have our state legislature, Supreme Court, governor, which kind of mirrors what happens at the national level. And then you've got like counties in there that also have power, and they oversee different things, and you elect county board of supervisors and different county roles, Maricopa County, like the instruction, the superintendent of schools. And then you have city level where you have city councils, town councils. And then you also, even smaller than that, have school districts. And so if you look at your voter registration card, no matter where you live, you have all these different districts that you're in. And so each one of those represents like your county district, your city district, your school district, your legislative district, which is the state level, like representatives and senate.
Where you fall.
Right. And then also your congressional district, which is who represents you in Congress, at the U.S., at the national level.
So that's at the federal level.
Yeah. So there are a
those
lot.
Representatives.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of different pieces involved, and it can be really confusing, who handles what. And ironically, the more local you get, the more control they actually have over your life, right? But we know much less about who is local than who is national, right? We know the national players, and we pay attention to those. But by the time those laws sort of trickle down into the states, there's certain things that affect us, but the local laws affect us much more directly than the federal laws, and we don't pay a lot of attention to those,
right,
which is unfortunate. And that's that's what we hope to change some with this
Yes.
conversation. But basically, the federal government handles big issues like border, right, or the defense, so war, federal relationships with other countries, the tariffs, international and interstate commerce, those kind of things that the federal government handles. And the states and cities manage local concerns, so like your education, police, fire, and criminal law, because most laws that people get arrested for are actually local laws, right? They're state laws. There are some federal laws that people get put in jail for, in federal prison for, but most of the legal issues that people have where they get put in jail or in prison are because they've broken state laws or local laws. Those are the ones that they get, and those can be the same over states, but there's also a lot of differences in what states allow and what they don't allow.
Yep, that's very interesting. Actually, I'd never really thought of that it's the local laws that they would be breaking, not federal laws.
Well, because even things like whether or not you're allowed to carry a weapon or how you can or where you can take those vary from state to state. And so that's why it's important. I mean, it's just one issue, but it's something that's fairly common, right? If you're a gun owner, you need to know what the laws are. If you're traveling to a different state, those state laws are going to be different than the laws where you live. And so you have to know what those laws are. Same with like drinking age and, different things, that what the laws are related to all kinds of different things.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And through all of this, we see that the founders have put a lot of thought into how the relationship between the country and states relates to the individual and protecting individual liberties. Can you tell us why the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, one, is so important to the balance of power between the federal and government and the states, but also why it's important as citizens to be aware of?
Yeah. So, like I said before, we started off as, the 13 colonies and everybody had their own government, right? So each one had, and that was a big deal that they were deciding to come under a federal umbrella and decide to give up a little bit of power, but they were very concerned about holding on to the power that they had as each individual colony, which then became a state, right? So they wanted the states to maintain that power that they had and not give it all up. This is one of the concerns that they had. So one of the things, and we did an episode, Allison and I did an episode, it's with last year sometime, talking about a little bit about the history of some of that, but talking about how the different amendments, and one of the things was that they did not. There was a group of people that would not sign and agree to the Constitution unless they agreed that they would add the Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments, right? And so the First Amendment, freedom of speech. Second Amendment has to do with firearm, with the right to bear arms. Fourth Amendment has to do with search and seizure, and that's why we get the Miranda warning if you're ever arrested. Not that I have any personal knowledge of that, but you know what I mean. Like all of those different things. Well, the 10th Amendment was the one that they were the most concerned about. And it said that anything that was not specifically given, any power that was not specifically given to the federal government would be maintained by the states. Because they didn't want the federal government, because they had just come out of England, which was very top heavy, right? The king ruled everything. And they didn't want to return to a situation where the federal government had control over everybody's day-to-day life and could really be oppressive. So they wanted to maintain local control. And so that's where the 10th Amendment came in, was to try to say, hey, anything that we don't specifically say you're allowed to do as the federal government, that right stays with the states. And so over the years, it's gotten really murky and people don't understand that. And the federal government has become way more, it's basically happened that what their fears were, right?
Yes, it was coming.
The federal government getting really, really top heavy. And right now you're seeing some of that being undone, President Trump has done some things to kind of get rid of some of that that bloat in the federal government.
Give power back to the
Right,
states.
because there's been this power, there's throughout, especially the 20th century, there were a lot of presidents who really just took on a lot of federal control through the Depression, World War II, different eras where the federal government took on a lot of power, and then they just held on to it, and they didn't ever give it back. And so it's been something that, and I think this is part of why people don't understand really that the state level, why it's so important, because so much of the focus has been at the national level. But I mean, this is one of my big things, and I know yours too, is that because we have an election coming up in 2026 where we're electing a governor, a Secretary of State, an AG in Arizona, along with our state legislature. And those are the elections that people don't pay as much attention to, but they're so, so, so important.
They're some of the most important ones.
They are. And people it's like if you're not voting for president, they don't pay attention. And it's so important to pay attention to those local level races because they really do wield a lot of power.
Yeah, because the people in Washington, D.C. aren't living in your communities and they don't know what's going on. So it's important. Yeah, definitely. I know that there's a few examples that we have to kind of bring this to light on how issues span across federal and state. One of the really big ones that I feel like happened quite recently was the overturn of Roe versus Wade.
Right.
And so Roe versus Wade, that was a Supreme Court case.
Correct.
And so, but this new one, when it got overturned, Dobbs versus Jackson, that started in the states, correct?
Yes.
Can you kind of talk through that for
Sure,
us?
yeah. And so really it's kind of it started with state power, then it went to federal control, and then it goes back to the states, right? So it really does span a lot of different areas because states prior to Roe versus Wade had their own laws related to abortion. So different states allowed it, some states did not allow it. It was fairly new as far as states legalizing and allowing abortion on demand. And then when Roe versus Wade was established in the early 1970s, it superseded any of the state laws. So any law like Arizona, for example, had a law saying that abortion was not legal. So when Roe versus Wade was decided at the Supreme Court level, which was not, it was a terrible case law. Not from me, but from legal scholars. I'm not a legal scholar, but pretty much everybody understood that was just really poorly decided, and it was basically them just wanting to mandate abortion on all 50 states, and they used this as a way to do it. So that overruled, because this is one of the clauses that happens in the federal government, is that if there's a federal law that conflicts with a state law, the federal law overrules the state law. So a lot of those state laws just stayed in place, but the federal law went into effect, right? So even though it wasn't technically a law, it was a court case, right?
Yes.
So then when Dobbs happened, and this is one of the things where it's like it seems like it's just all at the federal level, right? Where the Supreme Court decided it. President Trump had appointed people to be this was in his first term. He had appointed new Supreme Court justices. And that Supreme Court decided in Dobbs versus Jackson, and which overturned Roe versus Wade. And so it feels like it's all federal. But this is one of the things that I like to use as an example of explaining how this whole process works, because we wouldn't have ever had that case had it not been for state level government, right? Because it was the state of Mississippi that passed a law at their state legislature, right? So their constituents elected a state legislature that was pro-life. They passed this 15-week abortion ban, which was below viability. So that was one of the things that happened with that, was whether or not you were allowed to pass a law that ended abortion before viability, quote unquote viability. We've had many conversations about why that's not an accurate term, but they passed this law in Mississippi. They had to have a governor that would sign the law, which they did. They had to have an attorney general who was willing to defend the law, because there was a lawsuit that happened trying to say, hey, you're not allowed to make abortion illegal at 15 weeks. because this cuts into money, right? So it cuts into the big abortion business money,
right?
And so they didn't want this, and so there were people that sued and tried to overturn it. So then it goes up through into the legal system at the state level, and then in like a district, like one of the, the Ninth Circuit or the Seventh Circuit or the Fifth Circuit. I think this was the Fifth Circuit. And then it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had to decide to do it. But so yes, the Supreme Court was a big part of it, but it would never have even gotten to the Supreme Court had it not been for a state legislature that passed this law that then made its way up through from local to national and had this court case that overturned it for the whole country.
Yeah, that's such a great example.
Yeah.
Very important state power.
Right. Because we would
even have the power to overturn it too.
Correct.
Something is a big deal.
Well, and this is something that you've seen too with some of the things, even looking, this wasn't an example that we had, but the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote, right? They couldn't get anything passed at the national level. They were having trouble. So they started having states pass their own state amendments giving women the right to vote. And once they got enough states that put it into their own state constitution, because I don't know if people are aware, but each state has their own constitution, right? We have an Arizona constitution. Mississippi has a Mississippi constitution. And so each state, there were multiple states that had passed that as an amendment to their state constitution, which then gave it some power and some teeth to be able to push it at the national level. So you do see that working its way up, where if you focus on the state level, that sometimes that can have a national impact.
Yeah.
So
cool.
Yeah.
Another example that I was thinking of, because I kind of want to talk about how maybe like school boards can be related to different things that this state might be making laws about, or constitutional amendments. And one of the things I was thinking of was CRT and DEI and pornographic materials in schools. Can you kind of tell us how that issue is handled at all levels of government, right? And everybody is trying to have their, I don't know,
put their thumb on the scale.
Thumb on the scale and to do their thing. So what should we be aware of and paying attention to in relation to these issues and how they're related to each kind of different section of the government?
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe you can chime on this too, because I know your mom spends a lot of time at the school board level. But basically, and we just had an episode with the Goldwater Institute talking about DEI and that whole thing. But you do see where you have things happening at the federal level, where President Trump has done executive orders, and they've had things where they say, okay, you can't, if you have any of this in your business, you don't get any federal, or schools, you don't get any federal funding, because there's federal funding and there's state level funding that go into schools. But then also it does go down to every single states can pass laws related to all of those things. And the school districts can also fight what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. I mean, you have even with the school level, we had an episode also with the boys and girls sports, right? That was another example of of it being at every single one of those levels, because it was an executive order, and they've talked about it at the national level. But you still have schools, because we're in the middle of a court case, that you still have schools here locally, right, that still say, no, we think boys should be allowed to play on girls sports teams, and they're defying that, and it's going through the courts. And so it really is a battle between all of those different entities. And so it's important. But again, we have the most control over the local, like the more local it is, the more we can affect what we're doing. I mean, your mom is a perfect example, right, of going to school boards and speaking up, and then to where all of those school board members know her, and she knows exactly what they're all doing. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but we really do have the most power at the more local it is, the more power we have to speak up and to impact and make a difference in what's happening at that local level, which again can move up to the federal.
Right. Well, and I think one thing is just like also recognizing everything that is local around you that you can even do, because that was something that we had talked about like when she first started going to the school board meetings was like, oh my gosh, we have full visibility to everything that they're deciding on, all of the curriculum, all of the books that they're going to be having our children read. And so when she realized this, she was like, oh my gosh, well, I'm going to go and make my voice heard. And then she was like, well, then everybody knew who she was. And now she's kind of, they're like, oh no, she's going to talk about the fact that there's pornographic materials in our schools. And she's like, well, stop doing that.
And I won't say it
and
anymore.
I won't be here anymore. Yes. But it's true, because once they see that and they see that that's not what the community wants, then that's when change starts to happen. Because I remember after a few times she went, the superintendent at the time personally reached out to her and was like, why is this such a big concern? And she was like, well, because it's in our schools. And he didn't even realize like how big of an issue it was. So there's that too.
Well, and there can be such a big difference too between from school district to school district and school to school as to what is permissible and what's not. And a big part of that, I mean, so you figure we're all under the same state laws, right? In Arizona, just using Arizona as an example, that you were all under the same state laws, and even we're all under the same county laws related to education, but or policies really for education. But each school district within is a very different thing, right? Some of them are way worse on those issues than others. Some of them are much more conservative. Some of them are much more liberal, and it really depends on the school district and who's elected to those school districts, to the school board, right? As to that, so at a very local level, it's very different from school district to school district. What's allowed, what the policies are, what's promoted, what's not promoted, and that has a lot to do with the local level, because it's who they elect to be on those school boards. Which, I mean, think about, do you know who's on your school board? Do you know, can you name one person that's on your school board?
Right.
I think 99% of the people cannot.
And another interesting fact about school boards is that they don't have a term also.
Right.
So that's something really to be paying attention about.
Well, and this is something that this was not on my list of things we were going to talk about, but it goes with what you're saying, right? So also the other thing that ends up happening is that people get into office starting at a very local level, right? They get into on a school board, and then they move up and they run for city council, and then they get a name running for, being on the city council. They get some name recognition, and then they run for the state legislature, and then they run for governor, or they run for AG, or they run for U.S. Congress. So they get in the door at those very local levels. So sometimes you think, oh, well, it's not that big of a deal. But those people sometimes, not all the time, but they can end up moving their way up the ladder and running for bigger offices or larger scope offices because they get some name recognition at lower levels, depending on how much, what their aspirations are. But so it is really important to pay attention to all those local offices.
Yes. Okay. Something that I found that was interesting on our state website.
Oh my gosh.
Because this is something at the state level, our governor has a page on there with resources. It's healthcare. Is that what the title was? I didn't
Reproductive health.
Reproductive health. That's what it is. And so this is something that I found very interesting because this did not used to live on the website. Can you
Right.
share
Well, we
with us
didn't used
what's
to
on
have,
there?
and this is again something where those local. So we have a fairly conservative state legislature, but our governor is not. And so, but there's a website that's like reproductive health, az.gov, and it basically is geared toward helping, and one of the big sections on here is under 18. So it's helping, it helps people find, health services, but a big part of it is they're pushing birth control and they're pushing abortion, right? So trying to make that more accessible for people, why should the state government be doing that? I don't understand why that is a job of and this is one of those things where it's like, okay, is that really your job to do that?
Right.
I would say no. That would be my comment on that is no. But one of the things that's super concerning on here is that there are under 18, and it's like these, like one, I'm not going to give, I don't really want to give the whole website, but there's like information about finding abortion, how to get abortion services. Even I saw on here a way that they was kind of sort of explaining how they can get pills in the mail, which is against the law in Arizona, and it's against the law for under 18, but they're kind of, like handing them this information without really fully handing it to them in a really like underhanded way. But also one of the things that was on here was geared toward LGBTQ youth. And I'm looking on this thing, and it's this whole list of places that will send out like free chest binders to children, right? So this is under 18. Where they can get these things, or also like types of birth control that you can get that you can hide easily. So it's just the trying to get between children and their parents, right? Yep. And push this, make it more accessible for them to get these services around their parents without them knowing it. And this is what our state government is doing, yep. right? So again, those things may be, discouraged at the federal level. It doesn't matter. This is one of those things with the state and federal, right? So it doesn't really matter what the federal government is doing. Right. This is something that the state government is doing. And this is one of those things that we could speak up about at the state level, but most people are not paying attention to the fact that this is even here, right? That this is even a website on our state. This was also, and then the Attorney General has another website where it's like reproductive justice or something. And they're trying to report pregnancy centers that offer free help to moms. And that was the one that gave the warning, the consumer alert. Did you hear about that?
Yeah, I heard about that. I didn't know that it was that.
Pregnancy centers that offer support. So these are places that like give out free diapers, do free ultrasounds, help connect them with services. They just, because they don't offer abortions, they're a fake clinic and they need to be reported and to the Attorney General. So again, these local, right? That's something that the state level government has a really big effect on. We've talked quite a bit on this show about promoting and helping support pregnancy centers that help young women, help families. They provide a lot of services, and do those. We've even talked about related to like the Dream Center and what the Dream Center does, and how state laws can affect what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, whether it's homeless outreach, whether it's the Dream Center, whether it's pregnancy centers. It's those state and local laws that really hinder or support work that the church can do, or that organizations that work with the church, right? So again, like a pregnancy center, that's not a ministry of the church, but it's something that we promote and help and support. But the state level laws are the ones that, or those state officers, right? The governor and the Attorney General in this case, that really make it harder to do that work, because they don't like it, and they want to push abortion, and they want to push, getting kids on puberty blockers and chest binders and those kind of things, right?
Yes. Well, and I was going to say, it's just really interesting that like all of these are all related to either abortion, LGBTQ, Planned Parenthood, like every single one.
All of them, right? And all of them on that list,
yes. And so then it makes me think, okay, if somebody went and they're either taking a sex ed class in school or doing something, and they're like, oh, go to this website if you need more help. This is what's on there. Right.
Well, and that's a really good point, because I would imagine that they are, because why is this here? Right. Is your average teenager going to know that this is on here? Well, no, not unless this is a resource that's handed out at the school level. And that goes to, they could, but I doubt it. But if you have a school district that's very, leans toward all of this stuff, then they can be handing out, oh, this is a state website. This is safe, right? You can go on here and get all these resources. So it's very insidious the way that it all works. And again, so many people are not paying attention to any of that local stuff that it's really easy for them to get away with it. This connects to just recently there was it's not exactly the same, but it's in the same ballpark, that there was a state law in Arizona that was passed that the governor actually signed. She vetoed it the same or similar, very similar legislation last year, but she signed this one that had to do with age verification for pornographic websites, right? So saying that if you have to prove how old you are to get onto any websites that had pornographic material on them. So then I was reading, because I always like to read, this is one of the things that I do, I always like to read who's opposed to that and what do they have to say about it.
Why?
So in any of them, whether we're talking about abortion, I'll read, if we're talking about abortion, I'm reading what NARAL says or what Planned Parenthood says or, different groups like that, because I want to see what they're thinking.
Right.
Because it helps me to kind of frame the conversation.
Yes,
so
definitely.
This was one where there were these pro-LGBTQ groups that were saying that this law was homophobic so this is all that it did was keep if there's a website that has pornographic material on it, that you had to prove that you were 18 or older. Right? That sounds innocuous, right? Or it seems like a no-brainer.
Like pretty much any other legal thing that I'm trying to do.
It should be a no-brainer, right? So then my question is, if that is anti-LGBTQ, like why? And again, a lot of the books that are the pornographic books that are being on school are in that genre, right? They're pushing that agenda.
Yeah, right.
Or they're pushing abortion-related, right?
Yes,
so it's
hand in hand.
They're both topics, whether they're trying to encourage sexual activity among minors, right, and get them on birth control and encourage them to be sexually active, or whether they're encouraging them to be one of the, in one of the alphabet letters, that they, whichever category it is, they're kind of connected. But a lot of those materials are pornographic. They're very explicit. These are some of the things that you see in school libraries, in county libraries, that it's like you look at them and, when you see videos online of someone reading a book and the school board members are like, stop reading that. It's like, okay, why is this available for children if you don't want to hear it as an adult? If you're embarrassed and you think it's inappropriate, then why should we be putting this in front of children, right? So again, those things kind of go hand in hand, and they do go at all those different levels, right? So whether it's at the school level or the even some of the county libraries right now in Arizona, where you're talking about books that are inappropriate, that are being put in front of children, whether it's this state website that is inappropriate and has things that, okay, do parents know that the state is telling your 13-year-old daughter how to get a chest binder for free without you knowing about it, right? So those kind of things they're all local level things that we should be paying attention to, and we have an obligation to be speaking up on.
Yes, 100%. I think that's a very good point, an obligation to be speaking up on. And to be aware of also. I want to circle back to this really quick because you mentioned Trump's executive orders.
Yes.
And I think it's really important that we establish what the difference is between an executive order and a law is, and why Trump cannot just fix everything with executive orders, and kind of how that plays down to the states.
Right. And that's something that I think confuses a lot of people, right? They'll see something being signed as an executive order and they think, oh, well, that settles it, right? And we had this conversation when we talked about both DEI with Goldwater, that was an episode we did, and also when we talked with Kim Miller from Arizona Women of Action about boys playing in girls' sports, right? We talked about this specific thing in both of those episodes, if you want to go back and listen to either one of those. But that you have, so executive orders, they can be useful. Those things are great because they bring up the conversation. They do have a certain amount of power that they hold. But they don't settle the law, because for two reasons. One is because it's not permanent. So the next president can come in, just like, a lot of the executive orders that President Trump did were undoing things that President Biden had done. So, and the other way around too, right? So Biden did a lot of things that undid what Trump had done in his first term.
Right.
And so they can switch from year to year, or every 4 years, have somebody come in and do something completely different. So they're not permanent. And they have to be handled legislatively, either at the federal level or at the state level, or sometimes both. It's helpful to have them in both cases, because if you have something that happens at the federal level and then the state level conflicts. If it ever changes at the federal level, then the state law can come back into effect, just like we were talking about with Roe.
Yeah,
right? That it's like, okay, the federal trumped the state, but then if that gets removed, it goes back to the states. And so it's still important to have both levels of those things going on. And then even with the court cases, right? We were talking about with all of those things that you have to have the local level law settled. Because that is more permanent than an executive order.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the executive orders cannot fix it all.
No, they can't.
And we have to
they're
pay
great.
attention. They're great because they're things that we should be paying attention to in our own cities.
Correct.
So, are there any boys playing in girls' sports in my city? And unfortunately, I found out yes, but So that's why I'm very excited. We're going to be voting for Attorney General. But.
Well, and so so that to kind of tie this up because we're running out of time, but to tie this up, that I think that one of the things is you've got to be looking at the more local, like all of the national. That's what's on CNN. That's what's on. I don't know if anybody listens to CNN. Probably not, but their viewership's way down. But, Daily Wire, even Turning Point, right? Those most of what they talk about is at the federal level, so it's at the national level, which those things are important, right? They do affect us, but none of that is really dealing with the local level. So you kind of have to look for the local level things, and there are organizations. We've had multiple of them on here, right? Whether it's Goldwater Institute or the Free Enterprise Club or Center for Arizona Policy or Arizona Women of Action. All of those are local. I mean, Goldwater also is national as well, but they all of those different organizations, right? And there's more of them, but they all deal with what's going on in our state, and so you can find them. They're not as they're not going to be on a national news program, right? Or a national podcast. But you can find that information. You kind of have to look for it a little bit more, but those things are super important to be finding out about, and especially right now as we're preparing for an election next year that is going to be purely local. There's nothing national. No, there might be like the Congress, the U.S. Congress, I think, is usually on every election, but it's basically almost exclusively local, right? So state and there may be one or two things on there that are national, but the bulk of it is state and local. And those are the elections that people don't pay attention to. But if we could just get Christians to pay attention and to vote and know what's going on at the local level and to speak up, we could flip that entire executive branch in Arizona, right? We could take back and for some sanity, right, and get some of those things where we're not having this horrendous website on, or whatever the case is, right? There's a lot of different things. If we could just get Christians to pay attention and vote and make sure that we're looking for this next election that's in 2026, because it's a midterm, it tends to have a much lower voter turnout, which also means that we have a greater chance to have an impact if we can get people to rally and vote for that.
There's always a bright side.
I know, right? Any last comments on that?
No, I think that was all great. Get out and vote. Encourage your friends. Talk to people about this. That's what we always say. Talk to your friends about what's going on too.
So we won't know everything that's going to be on the ballot yet because it's about a year from now, right?
So we're just finding out who's running now, right?
They'll be finding out who's running, but the primaries will be next summer. Okay. I just bumped the microphone, but you never know. I'm always the one to make the noise. But if you are, the next summer will be the primary election, which is more important than the general election because it decides who's going to be running for governor, who's going to be running for state legislature, who's going to be running for AG. All of those things are going to be decided at the primary election, which the primary election in a midterm is the lowest of the low as far as voter turnout goes. So again, we really have an opportunity to make a difference if we can get people out to vote and make sure they're registered.
Yes, we do.
So yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us on Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church.
You can listen to this podcast on Apple and Spotify and follow us on social media to find all the info on the show notes. To learn more about Dream City Church, visit our website at dreamcitychurch.us. Thanks for listening.